some would like to believe, but our current tax system dates back to 1933 or 34. The emergency school tax was instituted in New Mexico to help pay for schools. There was an emergency in funding, and the joke is, of course, there's still an emergency because we still have the tax. It became the tax as we know it in the late 60s after the Franklin Jones Commission did kind of a rework of not just the gross receipts tax, but the income taxes and the tax administration rules in the Tax Administration Act. And since then, there have been tweaks made over the years, kind of like you see in the federal income tax code. But in terms of major substantive reform, I would suggest no, we haven't seen that. We haven't seen that since. There is no perfect ideal tax structure for a state. Every state is different. Every economy is different. And you can only tax what you have. So by default, you're limited. In New Mexico, we're blessed with natural resources, and that's helped pay a lot of our bills. There's been disproportionately high federal spending in the state of New Mexico in a variety of areas, and so our economy and our taxation system have been somewhat built around those two things. But since then, what's happened? Two things have happened. One, that system was not necessarily conducive to the private sector, the independent private sector, not the private sector that is otherwise dealing with those two sectors, the federal government or the natural resource industries. But in terms of the standalone private sector, I don't think we were ever horribly well tuned for that, to nurture that kind of activity, and nor did we have to be, because our economy was different and we had this other stuff, so it was a byproduct. Since then, what's happened, I believe, is we've made in certain respects our tax structure worse, more hostile to business growth, and at the same time, the world has changed. Everything is more mobile. Things are more competitive, not just regionally, but nationally and globally. So, as a result, even if we'd had an ideal structure in 1968, which at that time in this economy worked pretty well, the world has changed. So even had we not tinkered with anything, and some of the tinkering's good, some of the tinkering's bad. I'm not trying to wipe a brush across anything, but in terms of major tax changes, I mentioned this is a trend to the LFC the other day, since we were talking about trends in taxation. We do something significant to a major tax program very rarely. We cut personal income taxes about a decade ago. We took the tax off food and raised the gross receipts tax about the same time, within a year of that. What did we do? We recently reduced the corporate income tax rates. That was, and single sales factor is a little narrower in application, but that was considered a fairly big deal. We did an add back of itemized deductions in the personal income tax code. That was actually an increase or an offset to some of the cuts a few years after we implemented the cuts. Those are fairly broad-based, sweeping, and material changes. We raised cigarette taxes 10 years ago significantly, but we don't do that every year. It's the gross receipts tax that we tend to tinker with every year. This last year was a slow year, actually, and we created 4 new deductions. With meritorious arguments, every change has some arguments, and some of them I actually believe. But that was a light year. When I mentioned that, the response that I got from one of the senators was, well, it was only a 30-day session, and so we all know that this happens. And what happens is as we narrow the base of the tax, rates go up. It's just that simple. They're not tied, so it doesn't happen at the same time, so you don't necessarily see that you're shifting these burdens around. But most economists will tell you shouldn't tax intermediary transactions. The problem with our gross receipts tax is we tax intermediary transactions, which embeds tax costs into the cost of doing business at every level, and it cascades through your economy. Every time I buy something and pay taxes as a business, I load it into my price or reduce my payroll or profits, and then but more likely I roll it forward in price and pass it on to you. Where we really differ in terms of our taxation is we generally taxed everything, including services. About the same time we developed our gross receipts tax in the South, states started implementing what we consider more normal sales taxes. And these were taxes that were imposed on the transfer of tangible personal property. So the concept of service taxation didn't really exist there. They didn't really have much of a service-based economy back then. It really was based in tangibles. So it makes sense that they would do that. Most states in their sales tax structures will tax tangibles consumed by business that aren't directly resold. Economists would suggest you shouldn't do that because those are intermediate transactions and create this problem that we call pyramiding, and that's that cascading effect. But when they do it, they only do it with tangibles. Because our gross receipts tax was so broad in its base, and there's some merits to being broad-based, so this is a confusing topic for a lot of people. We should certainly tax consumed services. But where we differ from other states, if you're a professional business and you buy a desk in Colorado, you're going to pay tax on it, regardless of what the economists think. That's what's going to happen. The same will happen in Arizona, California, and New Mexico. The difference is when you buy the services that your business needs, accountants, attorneys, security, IT professionals, you name it, you're going to pay in Albuquerque a 7% upcharge, in Santa Fe over 8%.
Which only encourages a business to get their services from out of state. They'll be 7% cheaper.
That's correct. And so it's somewhat perverse. By our own design, we don't tax those out-of-state services. Now, I'm not suggesting we do, because that would compound the pyramiding problem even worse, especially for those that are forced to buy services out of state. But we put our own providers at a competitive disadvantage, which makes no sense. That's kind of a perverse situation. It just doesn't make any sense. But our own businesses, to the extent that they can't go out of state to fill these needs, when their entire cost structure, all these goods and services that they're buying, they're paying tax on, but it's worse than that, and it's not just tax on tax. That's what some people like to think, because it cascades through the economy. If I'm buying your services, I'm paying not just the tax on your service, but you have to pass a portion of the cost of the taxes that you're paying to your service providers in your charge.
Right.
And so when you're competing with someone out of state, whether you're competing here locally or competing on their turf, and you wonder why you have trouble matching their price, and you know you don't pay your people more than they pay their people, and you know you're not more profitable than they are, and you know your rent isn't higher than they are, what's the missing link? Well, one of those links is that embedded cascading of tax, and it's insidious because it's not transparent. You see the 7% charge on that final invoice, but you don't see the tax embedded as it churns through the economy to where it gets to you.
Sure.
And
if you have 5 services that are necessary for you to accomplish yours, you may be at a 10 or 11% disadvantage
right.
for an equivalent business in a different state.
Exactly. But and you can't tell that that's happening to you, so you can't make the appropriate adjustments, as most businesses do to deliver a product at a competitive price. They make adjustments.